October 29, 1929. Black Tuesday. The New York Stock Exchange floor is pandemonium. Traders scream, trying to unload stock before prices collapse further. Fortunes evaporate in minutes. By day's end, $14 billion in stock value has vanished, more than the U.S. government's entire annual budget. Millionaires are ruined. The Roaring Twenties party is over. What begins as a Wall Street panic will become the worst economic catastrophe in modern history, the Great Depression. Within 3 years, a quarter of American workers will be unemployed. Banks will fail by the thousands. Families will lose homes and farms. Breadlines will stretch for blocks. Shantytowns will spread across the nation. And the crisis will spread globally, destabilizing governments, enabling the rise of fascism, and setting the stage for World War II. This is the story of how the world economy collapsed, how millions suffered, how governments struggled to respond, and how the Depression transformed economics, politics, and society forever. The 1920s seemed prosperous. America had emerged from World War I as the world's leading economic power. Mass production, pioneered by Henry Ford's assembly lines, made consumer goods affordable. Automobiles, radios, refrigerators, washing machines, middle-class Americans bought products unimaginable to previous generations. Credit expanded, allowing purchases beyond immediate means. Advertising created consumer culture. The stock market soared. Fortunes were made seemingly overnight. It was the Jazz Age, the Roaring Twenties, a decade of optimism and excess. But the prosperity was built on unstable foundations. Income inequality was extreme. The wealthiest 1% earned as much as the bottom 42%. Most Americans lived modestly or in poverty. Farmers, especially, struggled throughout the 20s. Overproduction drove agricultural prices down. Farm incomes fell. Rural banks failed. The agricultural sector's problems were warning signs that went unheeded. Industrial production outpaced consumption. Factories produced more goods than consumers could buy. By 1929, warehouses were full, production was slowing, and layoffs beginning before the stock market crashed. The consumer credit boom meant people were already in debt, limiting future purchases. The prosperity was a bubble waiting to burst. The stock market itself was a casino. Speculation was rampant. People bought stocks on margin, borrowing 90% of the purchase price, betting prices would rise. As long as prices rose, this worked. Margin buyers sold at profit, repaid loans, and bought more stock. But this created an unsustainable bubble. Stock prices bore no relation to actual company values. They rose because people believed they'd keep rising. Warning signs appeared in autumn 1929. Stock prices wobbled. Some investors took profits. On October 24, Black Thursday, the market dropped sharply. Bankers pooled resources to buy stocks, stabilizing prices temporarily. But on Monday, October 28, the decline resumed. Then came Black Tuesday, October 29, panic selling. 16 million shares traded, a record. Prices collapsed. The crash wiped out millions of investors. But the stock market crash didn't cause the depression, it triggered it. The crash destroyed confidence and wealth. Banks had lent heavily for stock purchases. When stocks became worthless, loans couldn't be repaid, banks failed, people lost savings, credit evaporated, consumers stopped buying. Businesses cut production and laid off workers. Unemployment soared. Unemployed workers couldn't buy goods, forcing more layoffs. The economy spiraled downward. President Herbert Hoover initially downplayed the crisis. He believed in limited government intervention and voluntary cooperation. He asked businesses not to cut wages or jobs. He urged Americans to remain confident. "Prosperity is just around the corner," became his unfortunate catchphrase. But voluntary measures failed. Businesses cut wages and jobs to survive. The economy kept contracting. By 1930, the Depression was undeniable. Unemployment reached 8%, then kept rising. In 1931, it hit 16%. In 1932, 24%. 1 in 4 American workers was unemployed. But statistics don't capture the human suffering. Unemployment meant no income, no savings, no prospects. Families couldn't pay rent or mortgages. Evictions soared. People lost homes they'd lived in for decades. Shanty towns called Hoovervilles in bitter mockery sprang up in every city. Thousands lived in makeshift shelters built from scrap materials. Families slept in cardboard boxes. People foraged for food in garbage dumps. Bread lines stretched for blocks, run by charities and churches overwhelmed by need. Soup kitchens fed thousands daily. The Red Cross and Salvation Army tried to help but couldn't keep up. Children suffered terribly. Schools closed for lack of funding. Teachers worked without pay or not at all. Child nutrition declined, malnutrition and rickets increased. Children stopped growing. Many left school to work or beg. Families broke apart as fathers left seeking work elsewhere, often never returning. Mothers struggled to feed children on nothing. The psychological damage was profound and lasting. The Dust Bowl compounded rural suffering. Throughout the 1920s, farmers had plowed up prairie grasslands for wheat cultivation, encouraged by high wartime prices. When drought hit in the early 1930s, topsoil, no longer held by prairie grass roots, blew away in massive dust storms. The worst hit Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, and surrounding states. Dust clouds darkened skies and buried farms. Crops failed completely. The land became uninhabitable. Hundreds of thousands of farm families abandoned their land and migrated west, especially to California, seeking agricultural work. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath captured their desperate journey. These Okies and Arkies arrived in California to find thousands of workers competing for a few jobs. They lived in migrant camps in desperate conditions. California locals resented them. The American dream had become a nightmare. Bank failures cascaded. In 1930, 1,350 banks failed. In 1931, 2,293 banks failed. People who had savings accounts lost everything. The Federal Reserve, created in 1913 partly to prevent such panics, failed to act. It let the money supply contract, worsening deflation and making debt burdens heavier. This failure would haunt economic policy for generations. Hoover did take some actions. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, created in 1932, loaned money to banks and businesses. But it was too little, too late, and focused on helping corporations rather than ordinary people. Hoover believed in trickle-down economics, help businesses and prosperity would spread. But with no consumer demand, helping businesses accomplished little. Hoover's reputation was destroyed. Hoovervilles, Hoover blankets, newspapers, Hoover wagons, cars pulled by horses because owners couldn't afford gas, all mocked him. He became the scapegoat for the Depression, though many of its causes predated his presidency. His faith in limited government seemed heartless when millions were starving. The Depression went global. America was the world's economic engine. When it collapsed, international trade plummeted. American banks called in foreign loans. European economies, still recovering from World War I, were devastated. Germany was hit especially hard. The Weimar Republic faced economic chaos and mass unemployment. This created conditions for Hitler's rise. The Nazis exploited economic desperation, promising to restore German prosperity and pride. Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931, letting the pound's value float. This helped British exports but destabilized international finance. Countries erected trade barriers, tariffs to protect domestic industries. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930 raised American tariffs to record levels. Other nations retaliated with their own tariffs. International trade collapsed, worsening the Depression globally. In Germany, unemployment hit 30% by 1932. The Nazi Party grew from fringe to Germany's largest party. In January 1933, Hitler became chancellor. He would use emergency powers to establish dictatorship, rearm Germany, and set Europe on the path to war. Without the Depression's economic devastation and political chaos, Hitler likely never would have gained power. The Depression's consequences thus extended far beyond economics to enabling World War II. Japan also suffered. Economic crisis strengthened militarists who blamed democracy and sought expansion to secure resources. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, beginning its aggressive expansion. The Depression thus contributed to World War II in both Europe and Asia. In America, the 1932 presidential election was a referendum on Hoover. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, New York's governor, promised a New Deal for Americans. He projected confidence and optimism despite being paralyzed by polio. His fireside chats on radio made him seem a friend in Americans' living rooms. He won overwhelmingly. Hoover left office despised. Roosevelt's inauguration on March 4, 1933 came at the Depression's nadir. Banking was collapsing. 32 states had closed banks or restricted withdrawals. Roosevelt declared a bank holiday, closing all banks temporarily. In his inaugural address, he declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." This was psychologically brilliant. Restoring confidence was crucial. When banks reopened after inspection, depositors largely trusted them. The banking crisis stabilized. Roosevelt's first 100 days saw unprecedented government activism. The New Deal launched dozens of programs with alphabet soup acronyms: WPA, CCC, TVA, AAA, NRA, and more. The philosophy was try anything, see what worked. If something failed, try something else. This pragmatic experimentation contrasted sharply with Hoover's ideological rigidity. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, employed young men in conservation projects, planting trees, building trails, fighting fires. They lived in camps, earned modest wages, and sent most money home to families. The CCC employed 3 million men over its existence, building much of America's park infrastructure. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, employed millions in public works, building roads, bridges, schools, post offices, and parks. The WPA also employed artists, writers, and musicians, producing murals, plays, and state guides. Critics called it make work, but it put money in people's pockets and created infrastructure still used today. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, was an ambitious regional development project. The Tennessee Valley was one of America's poorest regions. The TVA built dams providing electricity, controlled flooding, and promoted economic development. It showed government could plan and execute large-scale projects successfully. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, addressed farm overproduction by paying farmers to reduce acreage and destroy crops. This seemed perverse when people were hungry, but the economics made sense. Raising prices by reducing supply helped farmers earn livable incomes. The program was controversial, but farm incomes did increase. The National Recovery Administration, NRA, tried to stabilize industries through codes setting minimum wages, maximum hours, and fair practices. Businesses displaying the NRA Blue Eagle symbol pledged compliance, but the NRA was unwieldy and ultimately declared unconstitutional in 1935. Its failure showed limits to government planning. Social Security, established in 1935, created old-age pensions, unemployment insurance, and aid to dependent children and the disabled. It was America's first federal social insurance program. Conservatives called it socialism, but Social Security became sacrosanct, transforming retirement for millions. The Fair Labor Standards Act, 1938, established a federal minimum wage, maximum work hours, and prohibited child labor. These protections, now taken for granted, were revolutionary. Business opposed them fiercely, but they passed. Labor unions gained strength. The National Labor Relations Act, 1935, guaranteed workers' rights to organize and bargain collectively. Union membership soared. The CIO organized industrial workers. Sit-down strikes, workers occupying factories, forced recognition. The 1937 Flint sit-down strike against General Motors became iconic. Labor management relations transformed. Not everyone benefited equally. New Deal programs often excluded or discriminated against African Americans. Southern Democrats insisted on this to support the programs. The AAA displaced black sharecroppers. The CCC and other programs were segregated. Social Security initially excluded domestic and agricultural workers, occupations dominated by African Americans. The New Deal's benefits went disproportionately to white Americans. Women's labor force participation increased out of necessity, not liberation. Women took any work available. They faced discrimination and earned less than men. Eleanor Roosevelt championed women's issues and civil rights, using her position as First Lady unprecedentedly. But systemic change was limited. Did the New Deal end the Depression? No. Unemployment remained high throughout the 1930s, never dropping below 14%. In 1937-38, a severe recession within the Depression showed recovery was fragile. Roosevelt had cut spending too soon, and the economy contracted again. Unemployment jumped back to 19%. What ended the Depression was World War II. Military production for the war effort employed millions. Unemployment vanished. Factories ran 24/7. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers as men joined the military. Government spending was massive, everything Keynesian economics said should be done in a depression, but on a scale inconceivable in peacetime. The economy boomed. Ironically, it took the world's deadliest war to end the Depression. But the New Deal's legacy transcends statistics. It transformed government's role. Before, federal government was small and distant. After, it was a presence in people's lives, providing social insurance, regulating labor and business, building infrastructure, protecting bank deposits. The New Deal established the modern welfare state. Conservatives have fought to roll it back for 90 years with limited success. Social Security, Medicare, unemployment insurance, these are now fundamental expectations. The Depression also transformed economics as a discipline. Classical economics said markets self-correct. Recessions happen, but economies naturally return to full employment. Government intervention was counterproductive. The Depression proved this wrong. Markets didn't self-correct. Unemployment stayed high for a decade. Something was fundamentally wrong with classical theory. John Maynard Keynes provided answers. His 1936 book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, revolutionized economics. Keynes argued that in depressions, government must spend to stimulate demand. Private sector won't invest when prospects are bleak. Government must step in, running deficits if necessary. Once economy recovers, government can reduce spending and pay down debt. This Keynesian economics became dominant for decades. The New Deal was partly Keynesian, though Roosevelt never fully embraced deficit spending until World War II forced it. The Depression shaped an entire generation's worldview. People who lived through it never forgot. They saved everything, wasted nothing, feared debt, distrusted banks, and valued security above all. This Depression mentality influenced America for decades. The generation that survived the Depression would build post-war prosperity but never lost the psychological scars. Popular culture reflected the Depression. Movies offered escapism, lavish musicals, screwball comedies, gangster films. Radio provided free entertainment. Programs like Amos and Andy and Fibber McGee and Molly entertained millions. But culture also documented suffering. Dorothea Lange's photographs, especially Migrant Mother, captured Depression desperation. Woody Guthrie's folk songs chronicled Dust Bowl migration and working-class struggles. The Depression politicized many. Some turned left. The Communist Party grew, appealing to workers and intellectuals who saw capitalism failing. Others turned right, to figures like Father Coughlin, whose radio broadcasts mixed Christianity with anti-Semitism and fascist sympathy. Huey Long, Louisiana's populist governor, promised radical wealth redistribution before his assassination in 1935. The Depression created political ferment, most of it channeled through democratic politics, but the potential for extremism existed. Roosevelt faced fierce opposition. The Supreme Court struck down several New Deal programs as unconstitutional. In 1937, Roosevelt proposed adding justices to the court packing. This failed and damaged his political standing. Conservatives called Roosevelt a dictator or communist. Business interests hated him, but most Americans supported him. He won re-election 3 times, unprecedented and never repeated. Different groups experienced the Depression differently. Urban industrial workers faced unemployment but had access to soup kitchens and relief programs. Rural farmers lost land but could grow food. Middle-class families tried desperately to maintain respectability while sliding toward poverty. The wealthy suffered proportionally less, lost portfolios but retained assets and connections. Psychologically, the Depression was devastating. Unemployment meant more than lost income. It meant lost identity, dignity, and purpose. Men who couldn't provide for families felt emasculated. The suicide rate increased. Mental health suffered. Family stress led to increased domestic violence. Yet families also pulled together, sharing resources and supporting each other. The Depression had paradoxes. Despite hardship, life expectancy actually increased, possibly because industrial accidents decreased with less employment, or because slower-paced life reduced stress-related deaths. Maternal mortality and child mortality decreased. Some historians argue the Depression's health impacts were mixed. Malnutrition harmed children, but reduced industrial exposure helped some. Globally, responses to the Depression varied. Sweden pioneered social democratic policies, combining market economy with strong social programs. This middle way between capitalism and socialism became a model. Britain struggled with austerity, worsening the Depression. Germany's response was fascism and rearmament. The Soviet Union, having no stock market and limited international trade, was insulated from the worst effects, a fact that impressed some Western observers and led them to overlook Stalinist horrors. The Depression's political consequences extended beyond enabling fascism. In Latin America, it destabilized governments and strengthened military dictatorships. In Asia, it contributed to Japan's militarism. Colonial powers' economic weaknesses strengthened independence movements. The Depression showed that the international economic order was fragile and that global economies' collapse could have catastrophic political consequences. The lessons learned shaped post-World War II policy. Leaders determined to prevent another depression created institutions: the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, to stabilize international finance and promote trade. Keynesian policies were adopted widely. The Bretton Woods system created stable exchange rates. These policies helped create the post-war economic boom. But disagreements about the Depression's lessons persist. Did the New Deal end or prolong the Depression? Conservatives argue government intervention delayed recovery. Liberals argue it prevented worse outcomes and provided necessary relief. Did World War II spending prove Keynes right? Did the Depression show capitalism's inevitable failure or its resilience? These debates continue. Modern parallels are often drawn. The 2008 financial crisis was compared to 1929. Policymakers consciously applied Depression lessons, preventing bank failures through bailouts, stimulating demand through spending, keeping interest rates low. The Federal Reserve, having failed in the 1930s, acted aggressively. Many economists believe these policies prevented a second Great Depression, but others argue they created moral hazard and delayed necessary adjustments. The COVID-19 pandemic's economic impact also prompted Depression comparisons. Massive unemployment and government spending on unprecedented scale echoed the 1930s. Debates about government's proper role, how to stimulate recovery, and whether to prioritize deficit reduction versus growth all reflected Depression-era arguments. The Great Depression remains relevant because fundamental questions it raised about capitalism's stability, government's role, social solidarity versus individual responsibility, how to balance market freedom with social protection, remain unresolved. Different ideologies draw different lessons. The Depression is economic history, but also a Rorschach test for political beliefs. From Black Tuesday to Pearl Harbor, the Depression decade transformed America and the world. It destroyed faith in unregulated capitalism. It created the welfare state. It showed government could and must act in crises. It enabled fascism and war. It caused immense human suffering but also solidarity and resilience. It ended an era of optimism and began an era of government activism. For those who lived through it, the Depression was a defining experience, more significant than World War I or even World War II for many. It shaped their values, politics, and life choices. Their children, the silent generation and baby boomers, grew up hearing Depression stories, influencing their worldview even without experiencing it directly. The photographs remain haunting: dusty farms abandoned, breadlines in city streets, hollow-eyed children, foreclosed families beside their possessions on sidewalks. These images capture a moment when American prosperity vanished and survival became uncertain. They remind us that economic security is fragile, that disaster can strike suddenly, that millions can suffer through no fault of their own. The Great Depression proved that modern economies are complex systems that can fail catastrophically, that markets don't always self-correct, that unemployment and poverty on massive scale can persist for years, and that only government intervention on vast scale can address such crises. It showed that economic collapse has political consequences, that desperation enables extremism, and that democracy requires economic opportunity. Today, with economic inequality approaching 1920s levels, climate change threatening agriculture, political polarization intensifying, and global economic integration creating systemic fragility, the Depression's lessons seem more relevant than ever. Could it happen again? Most economists say no. We have tools the 1930s lacked, including deposit insurance, unemployment insurance, central banks that understand monetary policy, and political will to intervene. But others warn that overconfidence preceded the 1929 crash, and that new forms of instability could trigger new crises. From the stock market's collapse to Roosevelt's fireside chats, from Dust Bowl refugees to New Deal programs, from Hoovervilles to wartime prosperity, the Great Depression was America's greatest economic crisis and remains a cautionary tale about capitalism's fragility, a testament to human resilience, a reminder of government's necessary role, and an unfinished story whose lessons we're still learning.